So, Worthy Vice Chancellor, Anandita Mitra Ma'am, Registrar, Professor Khera, Dean Research, Dr. Navleen Multani ji, my faculty colleagues, and my dear students, a very good morning to all present. It's my absolute honor and privilege to welcome you all on the behalf of Jagat Guru Nanak Dev Punjab State Open University, Patiala, on the special lecture on interdisciplinary research in memory studies. Today, we are fortunate enough to have with us Dr. Abhishek Parui. He is Associate Professor in Literature and Memory Studies at IIT Madras and Associate Fellow of the UK Higher Education Academy. He is the author of Postmodern Literatures and Culture and the Literary Matter, Metaphor, and Memory. He is the faculty coordinator of Center for Memory Studies at IIT Madras and chairperson of the Indian Network for Memory Studies. He was the recipient of the Global Fellowship from the University of St. Andrews in 2023 and the Institute of Advanced Studies Fellowship from Durham University in 2024. We are eager to hear from you, sir. So over to you, sir, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Walia. I start by expressing my gratitude to Professor Multi for inviting me to speak. I'm absolutely honored to speak in this forum of Guru Nanak College, and I very much hope to establish this collaboration with the institution in the times to come as well. Now, what I will do in the next few minutes, Center for Memory Studies, and then hopefully I can talk a little bit about the different disciplines which are invested in memory studies, and then I will end my lecture with a special note on the relevance of literature and literary studies in memory studies. So in other words, what is literary studies doing in this field of memory studies, right? What is the unique relevance, unique contribution that literary studies can make in memory studies? Now, before we begin, let me very briefly define and differentiate the two kinds of memory that we examine in our Center for Memory Studies. So there is one which is the molecular mechanism of memory in terms of how the brain remembers and forgets information, the molecular neural synaptic understanding of memory. There is also the more cultural understanding of memory, right, in terms of how cultures remember and forget, nations remember and forget. Of course, it's a bidirectional. So, the monument can also generate molecular reactions. So you can go to a monument and you can, experience whether euphoria, nostalgia, melancholia, sadness, etc., which are very emotional in quality. So the molecular monumental paradigm is a useful paradigm to look at in memory studies. Now, equally, memory is also about storytelling, right? It's also about the kind of stories which we tell each other, the kind of stories which become fables, etc., and how that shapes the collective memory. Is there any? Yeah, that's better. Thank you so much. So memory is also about the stories we tell each other, stories about a particular culture, stories how a nation tells itself stories through history books, etc. In other words, it is also about narratives. So again, we're looking at a relationship between neurons and narratives. So how does the neural aspect of memory and the narrative aspect of memory, how do they correspond with each other, which is where literature comes in great details. I'll talk about that later. So the molecular and the monumental, the neural and the narrative. So these are the dimensions of memory that we look at in our center. Allow me now to talk about two paradoxes in memory studies, which I consider as productive paradoxes in terms of how these bring together different disciplines in a very interesting way. The first paradox being, when we talk about memory, we must look at memory as an interplay of remembering and forgetting. Right? In other words, remembering and forgetting should not be seen as ontological opposites of each other, but as supplementary categories. They are cognitively connected, structurally connected, functionally connected. Right? So every time you remember something, you're also simultaneously forgetting something. So the brain, for example, is hardwired to forget. If we lost the ability to forget, we will run into some very serious medical issues. And again, notice how I'm looking at forgetting as an ability, not as a disability. In other words, if I ask you, what did you do on a certain day, let's say when something big happened, let's say India won the World Cup or some big political thing happened, you will tell me certain chunks of the day. You will not tell me, for example, how you had your tea or coffee in the morning. You will not tell me what was the color of the slipper you're wearing in the morning. So your brain would already have forgotten many bits about that day. It will only remember the important chunks of information. I use the word chunk quite deliberately because it is used, that same term is used in neuroscience as well as in cognitive narratology. So, for example, there's someone called Joseph Ledoux in neuroscience, a very famous neuroscientist, Joseph Ledoux, Ledoux, who works largely on anxiety, amygdala, that part of the brain. He talks about the chunking in and chunking out of memory, how the brain is a very organized machine, a very organized organ in that sense. It has this unique ability to chunk out and chunk in information. Now, interestingly enough, the same word chunking is also used by the very famous cognitive narratologist David Herman, who in his really interesting book called Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, that's the name of the book, Storytelling and the Sciences of the Mind, Herman talks about how even cultures do similar things. They chunk in and chunk out information, which is why every culture will have its unique fables, unique fairy tales, unique legends, because those legends and fairy tales and fables and moral stories will chunk in the information and the memory, which is uniquely relevant to that particular culture, right? So we find that metaphors become very important in collective memory, right? And what will work as a metaphor in a particular culture will not work as a metaphor in some other cultures because, various things like geography, topography, climate, soil structure. So all these things will also become important in the production and consumption of metaphors. So for example, what will work as a metaphor in Punjab will not work as a metaphor in Tamil Nadu, right? Because of the cultural differences, the weather differences, the climate differences, etc., etc. So all this external ecology around the subject also contributes to the making and the production and the consumption of metaphors, through which memory may be seen as a galvanizing function. That's paradox number one, that remembering and forgetting are connected categories. Paradox number two is the following, that when you look at memory, when we talk about memory, we sometimes tend to believe or assume that memory is almost entirely a retrospective activity, that is all just about the past in terms of how we reconstruct the past, how we retrospectively bring back the past, etc. But research reveals, both in neuroscience as well as in cultural studies, a large part of our memory investment is actually oriented towards the future, right? So in terms of how the brain remembers and forgets information will enable the brain and the subject and the self to move forward in time. So for example, just to give you one very banal example, if I remember where I parked my car in IIT Madras, I will be able to go back to it, retrieve it, drive back home. If I remember my address and my location, I will be able to move forward in time. Quite literally, this is a very banal material example I can provide. More complexly, how a culture, how a nation, how a particular community uses nostalgia, engages with nostalgia, will have profound repercussions in terms of how it imagines the future, how it anticipates the future. So a large part of collective memory is equally anticipatory in quality. It's not just retrospective in quality, but also anticipatory in quality, futuristic in quality. In other words, we're also looking at memory as a future orientation, as a future function. It's something which helps a particular community or a culture or a nation to move forward in time. Now, let's try to connect these two paradoxes now. So if I said at the beginning that remembering and forgetting, they have a dialectical relationship. They supplement each other, they connect to each other, they feed off each other, etc. And then I'm also saying that memory is as much a futuristic activity as it is a retrospective activity. Now let's make the connection between these two paradoxes to see how it works. So at a more macro level, let's say we talk about collective memory, how a nation remembers, how a nation chooses to remember, how a particular collective chooses to write its own history will have profound implications of the kind of future narrative it will build for its future citizens, for its children, for example. So, which is why you find that history writing is such an important process, a political process in many ways. It can be quite manipulative in quality because you are exposing little children to a certain kind of memory narrative, and you want them to consume a certain kind of memory narrative because these are the children who will become the citizens in the future. So the entire investment in history writing, history curriculum, history production, history consumption is towards the future, right? So futuristic quality about the politics of history. Allow me now to use a personal example, something of an anecdotal example, which will hopefully have some relevance in terms of what I am talking about to you right now. So when I was doing my PhD in Durham, I had a very good friend. Of course, I'll not name him. So we shared a house together. Very liberal, white British guy, very critical of imperialism, left-leaning, and all the rest of it. So he wanted to watch Hindi film, Indian Hindi Bollywood film, and we happened to watch the film, which I'm pretty sure most of you have seen, a film called Rang De Basanti. Right, it's an Amir Khan film, released around 2005, I think. Obviously, we watched it much later, 2011 or 12, I think, if memory serves. Now, as you watch in the film, as you know, some of you may have watched the film, would know, it is one of the first Hindi films, maybe, I think there are other films before and after we've done it, which depicts a very graphic description or illustration of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, right, the Amritsar massacre that took place. Now, as we watch the film together, this person who is, otherwise very, very vocally critical of the empire, towards the end of the film, he gets a little bit uneasy and uncomfortable, and he asks me this really blunt question that, I'm pretty sure that the British did atrocious things in India when they were, the empire was in operation, etc., etc. I'm very ashamed of it, etc., etc. But this event, the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, did it really take place, or is it a figment of imagination which is used to portray in that film? Now, obviously, I was very taken aback because, I sort of asked him the counter question: how come someone as educated and well-read and critical of political hegemony, etc., has no awareness of this particular event? He had no idea that this took place, and his answer was quite revelatory. He said, "Well, I don't know because it's not taught to us in history books." So if you ask an average British boy or girl about the empire or whatever, they will probably tell you, well, it was a bad thing, but hey, we give you railways, hey, we build the judiciary system, we give education system. So it is a very selective kind of memory which then got textualized into history, right? And the reason being is that is the kind of narrative we want to push forward in time. So we see how the two paradoxes are operational over here. Remembering and forgetting are happening together. Every time you commemorate something, you must also erase something. At the same time, memory is as much an act of retrospection as an aspect of future orientation. To push forward a certain kind of narrative that is helpful for you, in terms of a future citizens, etc. So allow me now to do this very cheeky experiment, if I may. I will give you the example. I will not name. I will give you the attributes, very selected attributes of two army generals, right? And I will tell you which one would you choose as a role model, as an example, right? So I will just name Army General A and Army General B. Army General A is a highly decorated military officer, has been decorated for valor in the battlefield many times. Very, very moral person in terms of character, never toxic, never misbehaves with the women around him. Everyone who's working around him, including the secretaries and underlings, feel very safe, feel very valued, feel very welcome, vegetarian, teetotaler, very affectionate towards animals, very averse to cruelty against animals. In fact, wants to promote vegetarianism as a means to protect cruelty against animals, never drinks, never smokes, never has any bad habit, and marries the one woman he loves, right? That is Army General A. Army General B is a classic example of toxic masculinity, alcoholic, racist, serial predator of women. Every woman who walks around him feels threatened, abusive to the core, racist to the core, very difficult to work with, like you said, almost entirely alcoholic, all kinds of bad habits, etc., etc. If I were to give you just these two attributes, Army General A, Army General B, and if I were to ask you, who would you pick? Just listen to these two attributes. Most of us would be likely to pick Army General A, right? Because, you know, they're decorated general, teetotaler, vegetarian, not cruelty for animals, respectful to women, etc., etc. The other one is alcoholic, toxic masculinity, etc., etc. So after a particular audience picks A, then I will obviously go on to reveal, well, congratulations, he have picked Adolf Hitler over Winston Churchill, right? Now, the reason behind this particular experiment is that I am giving you a very selective kind of attribute, right? So how do I want to remember Hitler as opposed to how do I want to remember Churchill? Now, Churchill, as you know, is constantly war, etc., etc., which is entirely true. The inhuman tragedies that were done by the Nazis, one of the most barbaric violations of human rights which took place, obviously was stopped to a large extent by Churchill's intervention. At the same time, it is also true that Churchill was also largely responsible for the mismanagement of what then became the Bengal famine, right? He was also largely responsible for the gross mismanagement and the gross violation of human rights, which contributed to the Bengal famine, which even by popular estimates killed more people than a Holocaust, right? Now, again, if you compare the Holocaust and the Bengal famine, you realize that. So everyone over this room, I'm pretty sure most of you have seen lots of movies about the Holocaust. There's Schindler's List or Pianist, read about that particular event, as we should, right? But it is very, very unlikely that, you know, even us in this particular room will know a lot about the Bengal famine unless we're researching on it. And I speak as a Bengali. I speak as someone who grew up in Bengal in the 90s and 2000s with very little memory, with very little idea about the Bengal famine. In other words, it is important for us to realize when we do memory studies, what kind of memories, certain kinds of memories receive privileged encoding, as opposed to certain other kinds of memory which are not considered memorable, in other words. So the production of memorability, the politics of memorability is at the heart of memory studies, which is why culture studies, sociology, anthropology, gender studies, all these become absolutely entangled in this marvelous epistemic network that we call memory studies. Allow me now to move on to an understanding of literature. What is the unique relevance of literature in this field of memory studies? Why we're looking at literature at all? Because surely when we talk about memory, there are aspects such as, for example, psychology. There are aspects such as anthropology, neuroscience, and all the rest of it. What is literature doing in this broad ambit of memory studies? And I speak now as a student of literature to other students of literature. What can we bring on the table which is of a privileged epistemic access, a privileged epistemic insight into memory studies? Allow me now to use one very canonical, perhaps a very boring novel that all of us have had to suffer, either as teachers or as students in classrooms. Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, right? Now, if you read Robinson Crusoe, and I'm assuming most of you have read it or taught it in classrooms, etc., it is consistently described as one of the first novels about classic realism, one of the first novels about, what then becomes the idea of imperialism. The white man gets shipwrecked, takes over the island, gun and religion and everything else, etc., etc. It becomes a meta text of the Protestant ethic, as studied by Max Weber, for example. The idea of the self-made man, which then can become a company, which then can become an organization, which can take over territories. Right? That is the story of Robinson Crusoe, to a large extent. If you read Robinson Crusoe, the original text by Defoe, you will know that the entire novel is a memory novel, right? So he's talking about what happened to him when he got shipwrecked many years ago in an island. Now, there are pages and pages of dense description where Crusoe talks about how he's building a log cabin, how he's building a particular farm, how he's, doing this husbandry with animals and cattle. So he describes the nails, the hammer, the gunpowder, everything gets a lot of graphic, detailed description at the beginning of the novel, because the whole idea is to tell the reader how he's setting up this particular territorial, right? The territoriality of Crusoe is set up using this particular architecture. So there are these pages and pages of description about the gunpowder and the nails and the wood and the cattle and all the rest of it. Very boring in some sense, but it's deliberately done. At the narrative level, this boredom is deliberate because it's also talking about slow time. So it's a very clever strategy in that sense. And this is the interesting, funny, disturbing bit. Towards the end of the novel, there's literally a half sentence where Crusoe said, when he comes back to England, he says, oh, by the way, I came back, got married, my wife produced 3 sons, and then she died. Right. So the wife in Robinson Crusoe occupies half a sentence in the memory. The nails in Robinson Crusoe occupy 2 pages. Right? Now that tells you something about the gendered quality of memory over here. This is a story written by a male, for male, about males. Right? This is a story about this entire male enterprise of setting up an empire. The only role of the woman over here, the only quote-unquote memorable role of the woman over here is to produce more men and then disappear from the novel. Right? So we see how even at a narrative level, the whole idea of privilege encoding as opposed to less privileged encoding is in operation. So literature gives us a very important aspect of memory, which we call in narrative function as focalization. What is focalization? The situatedness of the storyteller. Where is the storyteller situated? From which particular point of view is the story being told? How it is getting how it is unfolding, in other words, right? How is it getting unraveled in front of the audience? Now, of course, the situatedness of the storyteller is an important aspect because that will obviously reveal the memory biases. It will obviously reveal the kind of positions the storyteller is taking, which will then determine what gets into the foreground, what gets into the background, right? Allow me now to draw a little bit on cognitive theory and a particular philosopher, theorist. Now, Andy Clark is someone who is a computational cognitive theorist, actually. The first being the very famous 4E model of cognition by Clark. The 4E being embedded, embodied, extended, and active. I'll say it again. Embedded, embodied, extended, and active. So at any given point of time, Clark argues cognition is an asymmetric function of all these 4Es. It is embedded, as in we are a bunch of neurons and fibers and muscles and tissues inside. All these come together to produce embodiment. We become one body, then one self, then one subject, etc. Of course, that becomes enactive. How do we enact it? Through language, through rhetoric, through different forms of performative functions, and lastly, extended in quality. So this particular meeting we're having now is a good example of extended cognition. So I'm speaking across interfaces to you, across different kinds of devices and interfaces, right? So terminals, interfaces, these become a very important aspect of cognition as well. So if the Wi-Fi goes wrong, if the bandwidth begins to alter, that will also begin to alter the cognition, right? So the materiality of cognition, the interfaciality of cognition is part of the extended quality of cognition, right? So embedded, embodied, enacted, extended, right? So these 4E become absolutely crucial in Andy Clark's understanding of cognition. The second one that I am interested in, again by Clark, is the idea of the situated brain. Now, it's an interesting title, the situated brain, because when we talk about situatedness, we tend to think of it as more of a humanities, social science vocabulary, the situated subject, the situated storyteller, etc., etc. Whereas the brain seems to be more of a domain of neuroscience, more of a domain of fMRI, magnetic scanning, etc., etc. And that's the whole point. Clark argues even the neural mechanism of the brain, even the synaptic neural electrochemical mechanism of the brain is dependent on the context. It's dependent on the ecology in which that particular brain is situated. So just to give you one example, how a brain responds to rain in Cherrapunji will be very different from the way the brain will respond to rain in Chennai, right? So even the topography, the climate, the ecology will have profound implications in terms of the chemical behavior of the brain, right? So the chemicality of the brain and the sociality of the subject are actually dialoguing with each other. And this is where memory studies comes in a very useful way, because we have to take a look at neuroscience and social science together to understand to offer a more nuanced understanding of memory. The third essay by Clark that I find very useful is how he uses the metaphor of the brain as something which leaks in and leaks out information. The brain as a membrane, the brain as a liminal membrane, almost like a hydraulic metaphor, where information leaks in and leaks out, right? So again, we can use that metaphor to extend into a metaphor of liminality, right? Something between the borders, something between the membranes, which allows us to squarely bring back literature into this particular argument, right? Because literature is also an example of linguistic liminality. Literature is also an example of affective communication. It's not just effective communication, but also affective communication, right? So, for example, if I were to tell you, dear colleagues, when I was coming in for the session, I was walking to my office, I saw 15 flowers and I felt happy, right? That's one way of representing it. If I were to tell you 10,000 saw at a glance, tossing their heads and sprightly dance. Now, no one's going to ask me, I hope no one's going to ask me that, hang on, did you see 10,000 or was it 7,337, right? Because what I'm doing with that affective register is that I'm transcending data, right? I'm moving away from data and I'm moving into an affective economy of communication, which is why you'll agree the literature or the literary communication or the literary medium, because I'm very interested in the study of literature as a medium, because we talk about film as a medium, music as a medium, but literature is equally a medium, is that particular medium of language which has a very unique relevance and correspondence with memory, which is why you're more likely to remember the line of a favorite poem which you read 5 years ago, or the opening line of a favorite novel which you read 3, 4, 5 years ago. You're more likely to remember it than, let's say, the newspaper read this very morning, right? Because a newspaper read this very morning is not doing something that a literature or literary piece is doing. And one of the many things a literary piece does is that it produces what the Russian formalists called defamiliarization, right? The production of strangeness in language, the reorganization of language to produce strangeness, to produce the uncanny, to produce liminality, right? Which then corresponds back very interestingly with memory, because when you look at memory as an interplay of remembering and anticipation, liminality is all, fluidity is all. And there's no better device than literature at the level of language which can correspond with this, engage with this at an epistemic narrative level. Which is why you find, dear colleagues, that it's more likely that literary works get banned more often than history books, right? Novels get banned more often than history books. Writers get called out. Writers get different kinds of death threats for writing books of fiction. Because if you look at it logically, why would you ban something which is not claiming to be true? Why would you ban something? Why would you ask for censorship for a writer for writing something which supposedly or very explicitly is not claimed to be historically true or factually correct? The reason behind this is literature has a unique ability to mix historical reality with imaginative possibilities. In other words, it can tell you what really took place with what may have taken place, what could have taken place, what did not take place. In other words, literature also becomes a very important absence, a very important articulation of liminality, which is why you find that even in our school days, ever since we studied literature seriously, all our teachers told us read between the lines, right? The meaning is somewhere encoded between the lines. It's a very heavily coded language, which is why we find, in IIT Madras, we work with a lot of science and tech people in our center. They do fascinating work with algorithms and AI and AR, VR, augmented reality, virtual reality. But we tell them this with a certain degree of overconfidence, maybe, that literature was the first AR, VR device that we invented, right? The novel was the first example of augmented reality and virtual reality, an immersive experience, which is why we cry for Oliver Twist when we read about him. We cry for Uncle Tom when we hear about slavery. We root for Harry Potter when we want him to win, knowing perfectly well these characters don't exist, right? These enter our memorable imagination through an affective register of language, right? So the affective quality of literature the futuristic quality of literature, the open-endedness of literature, the cryptic communication of literature. It's a bit like algorithms. It's a very heavily coded language, right? And we find that the difference between competent reading and less competent reading is about the ability to decode, right? What is in there, what is packed into the lines, the unpacking, interpretation. All this become almost algorithmic activities in terms of reading a literary text. Now, allow me now to wind up with a mention of Joseph Ledoux. And I mentioned Ledoux at the beginning, very famous neuroscientist who works on basically anxiety, amygdala, anticipation, etc., and how he uses the word chunk in a very interesting way, which also connects to the use of the same word chunk by David Herman, the cognitive narratologist. Right. Now, Ledoux is famous for many things. I'll mention two, and then I'll move on to Herman, and then we can conclude with a reference back to literature. So Ledoux has this very interesting theory of memory, which is that of the reconsolidation model of memory, which basically says that every time we remember something, we don't remember the original event or the original memory, but we remember the last remembered version, right? So we remember the last remembered version, and the active memory then becomes the last remembered version from which we draw on. So every active memory is also an act of slippage. It's slipping away from the original version. It's almost like a textual deconstructive process where the center is slipping away all the time in a post-structuralist way. Now, interestingly, Ledoux brings in memory and anxiety in a very interesting way. Right. Now, I will end with anxiety now, and then obviously I'll connect to Herman if I can. Right. So Herman too talks about how cultures encode information through stories, literature, fairy tales, fables, etc. And the whole point of chunking in the moral codes, the memory codes in a particular culture is to preserve that particular way, right? So it becomes an act of preservation. So literature may be also seen as the first act of museumization. So how do you museumize stories? How do you put everything into a museum? In fact, I gave this lecture to University of Hyderabad, I think a couple of years ago. They have this really interesting project called Indian Writing English Online, where I talked about how for the longest time, there was no partition museum, right? And the only way the partition could be remembered is by reading the novels and the stories and the poems, right? So literature acted as a museum before there was a bricks and mortar museum, right? So again, literature became the memory machine through which cultures encode information and ensure preservation, ensure longevity, ensure endurance against time, how it can be made to move forward in time. Now, allow me now to come back to Ledoux and conclude with Ledoux now. So Ledoux works on anxiety, as I mentioned, and he talks about anxiety in a very interesting way. He says that, well, anxiety is obviously, it can be a very, very negative phenomena, but then there's an evolutionary quality about anxiety. We evolved as mammals. We are anxious in a unique way because the mammalian brain, the Homo sapiens brain, the higher primates that we are uniquely able to be anxious. Now, notice how the word ability and anxiety are coming together. So just like I said at the beginning that forgetting should be seen not just as a disability, it is also an ability. The brain must forget, right? In the same way, we are looking at anxiety also as an ability. Now, Ledoux has a very important definition, and this is a book called Anxious. You can all read it. It's a neuroscience perspective on anxiety as a cultural phenomenon. It's just called Anxious. It talks about anxiety as a cultural phenomenon today. But here's the evolutionary definition of anxiety in a mammalian brain structure, uniquely relevant to the Homo sapiens that we are. And Ledoux says the following: anxiety is a price that a human brain has had to pay for its ability to anticipate the future. In other words, you're only anxious if you can anticipate future scenarios and get feedback from the scenarios and try to figure out what will work, will not work. Now, mind you, it's not the same as fear. Fear is very different. Fear is very visceral, right? But the argument here is the humans, just like Salman Rushdie says, we are the only storytelling animal. We have the only animal which can tell stories to each other, create cultures through storytelling. Paradoxically, we are the only anxious animals, right? Because we can anticipate the future in a way that no animals can, right? And we can only get anxious because we have the ability to anticipate the future and produce simultaneous situations through which feedback can be sort of created and anxiety can be enacted, right? So I will end on that note. In an evolutionary way, as well as in modern memory studies, psychology and storytelling must be situated together, right? The whole idea of memory should be seen as a neural activity, psychological activity, synaptic activity. Equally, is a cultural activity, it's a monumental activity, it's a political activity. And the challenge as well as the excitement in memory studies is to bridge the gap between neuroscience and storytelling, between hardcore science and literature. And the closer we bridge this, the better we bridge this, the more chance we have to understand and unpack the magnificent mystery that is memory. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Abhishek Purai. That was quite insightful. We thank you for providing us insights on memory studies, and your lecture today, has again highlighted and focused on the significance of engaging in research that draws on the qualities of memory in the post-digital times. And very nicely, sir, you have given the live examples and allusions that you made to Rang De Basanti, your watching experience, and how Defoe is Robin Crusoe is also, is like a memory novel, and the focalization and the memory biases that you talked about rightfully, point to the fact that we all need to make ourselves aware about the chemicality and the sociality of the brain and memory, and the defamiliarization that you were talking about definitely goes a long way in creating this interplay of the memory and forgetting, the fusing of imagination, allowing literature to articulate the absences and all the lost things. And I think today's lecture definitely is going to provide all the researchers and the faculty members who are attending the lecture today as the kind of gaps that have to be bridged between science and literature. And very interesting observations, Professor Purai, you made about anxiety. And otherwise, anxiety is construed in negative terms, but that was a very positive presentation of anxiety. And I'm also looking forward to reading this book of Anxious. I think it will open up many more things, because again, this is something which is rare and not acceptable to all. And only if you venture into the road less traveled will you reach, destinations which are brighter and greater than you actually are. And definitely, literature, as Professor Abhishek has already remarked, is going to be like a memory machine, which is going to preserve all our cryptic communication, all sorts of historical realities, the political memories, and the social realities that we are facing today. And definitely literature is synaptic, and it has it amounts to producing that kind of monumental literature which can guide us dark time, guide us in the post-digital times. I thank you, Professor Abhishek Purai, for having accepted our invite and enlighten us about the memory studies. Because yours is a center, at IIT Madras, which is, I think, the pioneering institute. And you can correct me if I am wrong, if we have any other such center in India. Have we?
We don't actually. We also are the only national network for memory studies in Asia.
Yeah.
So use this opportunity to invite all colleagues from your university to visit our center. If you're ever in Chennai, just write an email to me. We're very happy to give you a tour. We also have the annual conference every year at IIT Madras. I think this particular year, the CFP has just gone out. So you scholars and colleagues are very welcome to submit abstracts. Hopefully I'll meet some of you as well.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I think you have a wonderful conference every year, and I think the participants who are not aware of this can just visit the website. And even now, I think the invite is it open, sir?
Yeah, I think the CFP is on now. The deadline for submission is 16th June, Bloomsday. So you have a lot of time.
Yeah.
So very welcome to
Okay.
submit. Hopefully, I can see some of you as well. Yes.
So before we get doomed, we can spring up to it.
Yeah. Right. Wonderful.
Yeah. So, if at all any questions or any kind of compliments for the lecture, you are most welcome to raise your hand, unmute yourself. As sir has another meeting, he is with us here only for 5-10 minutes, right? So,
I'm also
in
happy.
case any.
If you can email me, I'm very happy to respond to your emails. If you have any longer questions,
Okay,
please.
okay, that is wonderful.
Yeah.
And we definitely, would seek your guidance for setting up one center for memory studies here at Jagat Guru Nanak Dev Punjab State Open University. Maybe in the coming times we will visit Chennai and might invite you to Patiala. Yeah,
Absolutely.
despite the Wi-Fi problems that we had today in Patiala, I'm glad that we could make this session happen. Thank you so much for connecting. So I also thank my technical team, the administration at the Jagat Guru Nanak Dev Punjab State Open University Patiala, my colleagues and Dr. Kuldeep Walia, who today moderated the session, my technical assistants, Mr. Mohanjeet Singh Payal, who had been sending invites to all, Mr. Maninder Jot, and the whole IT team for having, supported. I'm grateful to all the participants from institutes all over for having connected with us for this special lecture. Thank you, Dr. Abhishek, for your very insightful lecture on memory
Very much.
studies.
Right.